Hello. The last time we spoke, we were talking about the Indus Valley civilization. In case we did not talk about their decline, I'll just briefly summarize what we can see here. We know that things started going badly for them, although there was several potential causes for this decline in their civilization. Originally, people thought that there might have been invaders that came in and took them out, but now that's kind of an unlikely cause. The bigger problems seem to be related to environment issues. Just as geography and environment plays a huge role in helping a civilization to grow and thrive, environment can also lead to problems. We think potentially that the Indus Valley civilization ran out of trees because they were cooking up all these bricks to make their homes and houses and cities. And without that wood resource, they were lacking materials to keep their society going. We also noticed that um, people have analyzed the mud found in the streets of Mohenjo-Daro. And the mud that they find there is river mud, which is weird because there's no river near the site of the cities today. Um, so the mud makes it seem like there would have been a major flooding event that overwhelmed the city, but there's no river nearby. And people wonder, how could that be the case? So far, the current theory is that there must have been some kind of earthquake, which completely rerouted the river. So there was a river near Mohenjo-Daro that flooded and might have overflooded and destroyed the city. And then an earthquake may have then changed the course of that river later, so that there was no point in building the city back up because why build the city? Why work on a city? Live in a place that's not connected to a river when they're so useful and needed for cities. So, probably a combination of all these things ended up leading to the downfall of the Indus Valley civilization. But they're not the only people that existed in India. There's also a group called the Aryans or the Aryans. These guys were Indo European nomads. We've talked about nomads before, and we've talked about the Indo Europeans before. They came into India from the northwest, from Central Asia. They intermarried, blended with the local Indians, and created a new group that we now call the Aryans through acculturation, which is basically just a fancy name for the blending of two cultures. It's kind of like cultural diffusion, except that often when we talk about cultural diffusion, we're just talking about ideas. Here, we're talking about the literal blending of cultures because these two groups, these Indo European nomads and the local people of India, literally blended together through marriage and having children. Now, the early Aryans did not build cities and left very little archaeological evidence, which makes sense because their ancestors, the first people that came into India, were nomads. And then, as we know, nomads don't build cities. If you don't have cities, you don't have a lot of stuff to leave behind. Um, so the question is, where do we find out about these people, the Aryans? And most of what we know comes from a collection of hymns and chants and rituals and religious teachings called the Vedas. Um, the Vedas were these songs, essentially prayers, that were recited from memory over and over for thousands of years before they were finally written down. In the same way that stories from like Greek mythology and Roman mythology are recited orally before they were ever written down. This famous text tells us a lot about the Aryans. They were warriors, they liked food and drink, chariot races, dice games, cattle. And then even after they adopted agriculture, they were still kind of in that sort of nomadic, pastoral, follow your animals around with you everywhere they go. So a really interesting group, the Aryans. And as an Indo-European group, that means they have some connection to the language that we speak today, which is very interesting. Here's a picture of the Vedas if you're interested in what they look like. So you have to imagine that this is a written version of a text that was said only orally for hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, these guys gave up their nomadic ways and became agrarians. They became domesticated, or sorry, they became farmers like most civilizations do. And they moved into the Ganges River basin, so the Gangetic Plain area. Um, they formed these tribes that were led by people called Rajas, which are basically like war leaders that would have a kind of little assembly of other warriors that would help them make decisions. And there was a lot of conflict between these different tribes. Remember, everybody's competing to live in the same place near the same good river, the Ganges. And so, good land is at a priority. And so when, two groups are going to butt heads against each other, they're going to fight and struggle, and then one group is going to come out on top. Okay? So a lot of the stories that we have about the Aryans are about like inner warfare, warfare between other Aryan groups. Um, and one of the things that we're told is that there was a group of Arya tribes that were light skinned that fought against a darker skinned group of Dasas, okay, that were then pushed into southern India. And this struggle, this series of battles between the Aryas and the Dasas, okay, led to the development of a system called the Varna. Varna literally means color, but it's something that's very much closer to what we might call class, like as in a social class. Okay? Originally, it was a way of putting the dasas into their place as subservient, but it turned into a system that became very widespread in India and would have massive repercussions on the culture of India. And we'll talk more about that in a very short amount of time. In case you were wondering, the Varna became these, and you can take a look at these here: the Brahmin, the warriors, the Vaishya, the Sudra. We'll never ask you to know all these important, these names unless I specifically tell you otherwise. But just notice that these are a group of classes that people are born into, and out of which they cannot leave, they cannot change. These go in order from top down, the most important, the highest status, to the lowest status. So the Brahmin are priests and scholars at the top, warriors in the next step, herders, farmers, artisans, merchants at the bottom. Shudra are basically like laborers. And then the final group, the group that most people don't even include in the group of four, are this group called the Dalits, the untouchables, who have all the worst jobs. They have all the bad jobs. We'll talk about this extensively, so don't worry too much about them right now. But just as long as you understand that a class system was developed by the Aryans, which is then going to have big impacts later on, that's an important thing for you to know. As far as their religion goes, the Aryans were polytheistic like everybody else. They had a chief male deity named Indra, who basically is an alternate form of Zeus, who had a thunderbolt. They had lots of other gods, some of whom you might have heard of. Most important, though, is they developed this spiritual concept called the Brahman. Now, we're going to talk about the Brahman at length in the next section. But for our purposes, the most important thing for you to know is that the Brahman was created by the Aryans, and it's a single spiritual power that exists beyond the gods of the Vedas and resides in all things. That might be a little hard to wrap your head around. Like I said, we're going to talk about it more later, but kind of think of it as if there was a spiritual power that existed in all things. That would be the Brahman. We also see in Aryan religion the use of mystics, sort of special religious figures, kind of like priests, whose job it is to interact with the divine, to seek communion, so contact with the divine. Communion that you might know from going to Christian mass or Christian liturgy. Communion doesn't just mean food or drink or the thing that you eat as part of the mass, but communion means interaction. A being together, and the act of eating communion at church is an act of being together with God and with each other. So communion, unity, interaction with divine forces is the thing that mystics seek through things like meditation and yoga and all sorts of spiritual and body discipline. Again, the most important thing to note is that these things were created by the Aryans, things like the Brahman and mysticism, but they're going to show up later. You're going to see the connections they have to later Indian religion as we move forward from here. Okay. The Aryans also had a pretty solid literature, amount of literature, once they started writing stuff down. And the language that they used to write things down was called Sanskrit. a very beautiful looking language that was originally developed only for use by priests. But then later, once it was invented, it started getting used for all sorts of things, like writing down poems and writing down stories. Specifically epic poems, sort of long works, kind of like the Iliad and the Odyssey, if you're familiar with them from Greek literature. But the two big poems that the Aryans came up with are the Mahabharata, um, arguably the most famous of India's epics. This is basically the story of how the Aryan tribes were fighting against each other. But if you read, between the lines, you can get a lot of interesting information about all sorts of things. Specifically, a section of it called the Bhagavad Gita talks about the soul, for instance, and the importance of duty over desire. There's also another famous poem called the Ramayana, which is the story of Rama, who was rescuing his bride Sita from a demon king named Ravana. This text kind of became like a story of like what it means to be a good person. You should be like Rama. You should act the way Rama acts, or you should act the way this person acts in the story, and not act the way that a person acts in the story. One's a famous battle thing, which tells us a lot about culture, and the other is another cultural work that tells us a lot about specifically virtue and morals. And that's it. Very brief little closer for the early civilizations of India. We will continue to talk about Indian religion specifically, but also other things in the next section. Thanks very much.